The compound had a particular kind of quiet that Grace Bennett had learned to read the way other people read weather. It wasn't the quiet of rest. It was the quiet of people trying very hard not to be noticed. 3 days ago, 1st Platoon had lost Corporal Ames on a route they'd driven 100 times before. Grace didn't know all the details yet. She suspected no one did. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. She knew the shape of it. A convoy. A device buried where it shouldn't have been. A delayed medevac that everyone was too polite to blame out loud. She knew that Ames had been 23, that he collected patches from every unit he'd ever worked with, that his mother lived in Ohio and had already been notified. What Grace paid closer attention to was what came after. She stood near the back of the memorial formation that morning, close enough to see faces, but far enough not to be part of the front row where the officers stood. The battalion commander spoke well, brief, sincere, the right amount of silence between sentences. The flag was folded with the precision that came from practice nobody wanted to have. Grace watched not the ceremony but the men receiving it. Sergeant Reyes stood at parade rest with his jaw locked so tight she could see the muscle working under his skin. 2 positions down, Specialist Doyle stared at a fixed point somewhere past the formation, his eyes dry in a way that looked more like control than absence of grief. They had been close once. Grace knew that much from 6 months of sharing a compound with these men, watching them eat together, needle each other, cover each other's shifts without being asked. This morning they stood 4 feet apart and might as well have been on different continents. Near the end of the second row, a lance corporal she recognized but couldn't yet place by name kept his eyes on the ground the entire time. He didn't cry. He didn't fidget. He simply looked like a man waiting for something to be over. Grace had been in the Army long enough to know that a memorial formation was not where the real work happened. The real work happened in the weeks after, in the small rooms and quiet hours when the flags came down and everyone else expected these men to simply continue. She had slept maybe 6 hours across the last 2 days. Her uniform was clean because she'd made herself iron it that morning, a small ritual of order in a week that had none. She was tired in a way that sat behind her eyes and made her voice feel thinner than usual, and underneath the tiredness was something she rarely let herself examine too closely, a low, persistent doubt about whether anything she did in the coming weeks would actually reach these men, or whether grief this size simply had to be endured until it wore itself down on its own schedule. She had seen units come apart after losses like this. She had also seen units come back together, slowly, in ways that had nothing to do with speeches and everything to do with someone being willing to sit in a room and not look away. After the formation ended and the platoon dispersed in that particular scattered silence of men who don't know where to put themselves, Grace walked back to her office, a converted supply room with a metal desk, 2 folding chairs, and a space heater that worked when it felt like it, and did something she'd learned mattered more than people expected. She left the door open, not propped for ventilation, propped so that anyone walking the corridor after hours would see a light on and know, without needing to knock formally or explain themselves, that someone was there and willing to talk. It was a small thing. She had learned that small things were often the only things that worked. She sat behind the desk with a stack of paperwork she had no intention of finishing tonight, and waited, the way she often waited, without any certainty that waiting would produce anything at all. It was almost 2100 when she heard footsteps slow in the hallway outside. They stopped, started again, stopped once more, right at her doorway, the particular hesitation of someone deciding whether 4 days of holding something in was still less painful than saying it out loud. Grace didn't look up right away. She'd learned that too. That sometimes the kindest thing was to let a person choose the moment themselves, without the pressure of being watched while they chose it. "Chaplain," the voice said. "Sergeant Reyes." "Come in," Grace said, and closed the folder in front of her. "Doors open for a reason." Reyes didn't sit right away. He stood just inside the doorway with his hands loose at his sides, like a man who'd rehearsed walking in but hadn't planned much past that. "I can come back," he said, "if you're busy." "I'm not busy." Grace gestured to the folding chair across from her desk. Sit if you want. Stand if you want. Door stays open either way, unless you'd rather I close it. Open's fine." He sat, finally, on the edge of the chair, elbows on his knees, looking at the floor between his boots. For a while he didn't say anything, and Grace let the silence hold. She'd learned this too, over the years, that the first thing a person said after that kind of silence was rarely the real thing. It was a warm-up, a test of whether the room was safe. "I made the call on the route," Reyes said eventually. 2 weeks ago, I flagged that stretch as slow but clear. Command shifted the timeline. I signed off on it anyway." Grace didn't answer immediately. She'd heard versions of this sentence before, in different rooms, from different soldiers, always delivered with the same flat certainty, as if saying it plainly enough might finally make someone argue back and win. "You believe that's why Ames is dead," she said. "I know it's why. You know the timeline changed. You know you signed off. Those are facts." Grace kept her voice even. "The rest of it, the why he's dead part, that's a story you've been telling yourself for 3 days without anyone else in the room to check it against. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying you haven't tested it on anyone but yourself yet." Reyes looked up at that, something flickering behind his eyes that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite anger. "Doyle thinks the same thing. He's just polite enough not to say it to my face anymore. He said that to you. He doesn't have to." Reyes's jaw tightened. "We don't talk. 6 days ago we were splitting a case of MREs arguing about which one was worse. Now he looks through me like I'm part of the wall." Grace filed that away without pushing on it. 2 men, once close, now silent with each other. That kind of rupture rarely healed by being confronted head-on too early. It needed time, and it needed both of them separately believing that someone was actually listening before either would risk listening to the other. "I'm not going to tell you it wasn't your call," Grace said. "It was. But a call made with the information you had 3 weeks ago isn't the same thing as a decision made knowing what you know now. You're judging the first with the second. Most people do. It doesn't make it accurate." Reyes didn't respond to that directly, but something in his shoulders loosened by a fraction. Not resolution, just the smallest release of pressure. They talked another 20 minutes, mostly about small things. Sleep, food, whether he'd called his wife yet. Grace didn't try to close the loop on the guilt tonight. She'd learned that pushing too hard on the real wound in a single sitting usually just taught a man to stop coming back. When Reyes left, he paused at the door. "Doyle's not going to come talk to you, just so you know. He doesn't do this." "That's all right," Grace said. "The door's open either way." Doyle came 2 nights later, and true to Reyes's prediction, he didn't come to talk about feelings. He came to ask, almost aggressively, whether Grace had heard anything more about the after-action review, whether anyone was going to be held accountable for the delayed medevac. Grace answered honestly that she didn't know, that it wasn't her area, and that she understood why he needed to ask anyway. It took nearly 40 minutes before Doyle said anything about Reyes at all, and when he did, it came out sideways, folded into a complaint about squad logistics that had nothing to do with the real thing underneath it. "He used to double-check everything. That day he didn't." "That's not like him." "Sounds like you know him pretty well," Grace said. "Knew him?" Doyle's voice had an edge Grace recognized. Not hatred, but grief wearing hatred's clothes because grief alone felt too exposed to carry around a platoon full of people watching you. "I don't know what he is now." Grace didn't try to defend Reyes to him. Not that night. She simply listened and asked the kind of small, specific questions that let a person's anger run its course without being either fed or extinguished before it was ready. It was in the 3rd week of these evening visits, faces rotating through her doorway, some regular, some appearing once and never again, that Grace first heard the name Whitfield mentioned by someone other than a duty roster. It came from the platoon medic, in passing, almost as an afterthought. Whitfield's been giving stuff away. His multi-tool, a watch his dad gave him, said he wasn't going to need it anymore. The medic shrugged like it was strange, but not necessarily alarming. Probably just weird post-deployment stuff. Grace had heard that phrase before too, probably just, and had learned more than once not to trust it. The weeks folded into each other the way they always did downrange. Days marked less by the calendar and more by who showed up at Grace's door and who didn't. Reyes kept coming, steadier now. The guilt still present, but no longer the only thing he talked about. He'd started sleeping again, he said, most nights. Doyle came less often, and when he did, he talked about everything except Reyes, which Grace understood by now was its own kind of progress. A wound that had stopped being touched raw every single day, even if it hadn't closed. She tried twice to find a natural way to get the two of them in the same room. Both attempts fell apart before they started. She mentioned to Doyle that Reyes had asked how he was doing. Doyle's only response was a short laugh with no humor in it. She mentioned to Reyes that Doyle seemed to be struggling with sleep too, hoping it might open a door. Reyes just nodded and looked away, unwilling to be the one to walk through it first. Grace had learned a long time ago that trust didn't move on anyone's timeline but its own. Pushing two men together before they were ready usually didn't produce reconciliation. It produced a performance of reconciliation, polite and hollow, that made the real thing harder to reach later. So she let it sit, checking in with each of them separately, watching for some sign that the ice might be ready to move on its own. It was Whitfield who kept pulling her attention sideways. She started noticing him deliberately after what the medic had said. Not staring, not making it obvious, just paying the kind of attention that came from 12 years of learning what to look for. He ate alone now, at the far end of the mess tent, when he ate at all. He'd stopped going to the makeshift gym with the rest of his squad, something Reyes mentioned once without seeming to realize its weight. Whitfield used to be the one dragging everybody else to work out. Now you can't get him to leave his rack. Grace found a reason to talk to him directly the following week. Nothing formal, just a comment in passing near the motor pool about a book he'd once mentioned liking. He answered her questions politely, briefly, with the practiced ease of a man who'd gotten very good at giving just enough to end a conversation without raising concern. It was smooth. Too smooth. Grace had sat with enough grieving soldiers to know that genuine steadiness and performed steadiness didn't feel the same, even when they looked identical from a distance. She invited him to stop by sometime, the way she invited everyone, without pressure. He said maybe. He didn't come. 10 days after Ames's death, Whitfield finally did knock, but not for the reason Grace expected. He came ostensibly to ask about paperwork, something about survivor benefits for Ames's family that he wanted to make sure had been filed correctly. It was a strange thing for a lance corporal to be tracking so closely, and Grace said as much, gently. Somebody should make sure it's right, Whitfield said, in case people forget to check later. In case who forgets? He shrugged, eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder. Anybody. People move on. That's just how it goes. It was an ordinary sentence. Grace had heard soldiers say some version of it 100 times, usually meaning nothing more than tired cynicism. But something about the flatness in Whitfield's voice when he said it, the total absence of complaint, like he wasn't frustrated by the idea, just quietly certain of it, sat wrong in her chest for the rest of the night. She didn't confront him. Not yet. She'd learned that moving too fast on a suspicion like this could close a door permanently, especially with someone who had clearly gotten skilled at appearing fine. Instead, she went to see Doc Alvarez, the company medic, under the pretense of following up on something unrelated, and steered the conversation carefully toward Whitfield. He's given some things away, Alvarez confirmed, lowering his voice even though the aid station was empty. I noticed too. I flagged it to his squad leader, but nothing formal. Wasn't sure it rose to that yet. You think it's serious? I don't know yet, Grace admitted. I think it might be. The problem sat with her the rest of that day in a way few things had in a long time. She was not a mental health provider. She had no authority to order an evaluation, no clean protocol that told her exactly when concern became crisis. What she had was 12 years of sitting with soldiers at their worst moments, and an instinct, imperfect but rarely wrong, that told her Whitfield was somewhere close to a line he hadn't crossed yet, but might. She also understood the risk on the other side. If she moved too fast, too formally, and she was wrong. If this was ordinary grief dressed in unfamiliar clothes, she could shatter the fragile trust that let a man like Whitfield walk near her office door at all. Soldiers talked. If word got out that visiting the chaplain got you flagged and pulled from your unit, that open door she'd left burning every night for 3 weeks would close, not just for Whitfield, but for everyone still deciding whether it was safe to walk through it. She sat with that tension long after the compound had gone quiet, turning it over without finding an answer that felt certain. What she did know, by the time she finally turned off her light, was that she couldn't wait for certainty. She had waited with soldiers before, hoping the next conversation would be the one where they said what they needed to say on their own. Sometimes there wasn't a next conversation. Grace found Whitfield the next evening near the motor pool, sitting alone on an overturned crate with his rifle broken down in front of him for cleaning, though he hadn't touched the parts in several minutes. The light was fading, that particular gray hour when the compound quieted before night watch changed over. She didn't send for him through his squad leader. She didn't loop in command first, though a smaller, more cautious part of her mind told her that might have been the safer path, the one that protected her if this went wrong. But she had learned, over years of doing this work, that the moment you went around a struggling soldier instead of toward him, you often lost him for good, whatever the paperwork said afterward. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. Whitfield looked up, and for just a second, before he caught it, something crossed his face that looked almost like relief. Then it closed over, the way it always did. "Free country, Chaplain." "Well, free enough." Grace sat on the crate beside his, not directly facing him, angled the way she'd learned put people more at ease than a face-to-face confrontation. For a while, neither of them spoke. She let the quiet stretch longer than was comfortable, longer than most conversations allowed, because she needed him to understand this wasn't a routine welfare check she'd cross off a list and move past. "I want to ask you something," she said finally, "and I want you to know before I ask it that I'm not here to write a report. I'm here because I'm worried about you, and I'd rather be wrong and have you angry with me than be right and have said nothing." Whitfield's hands stilled completely over the disassembled rifle. "Okay. You gave Doc Alvarez your watch, the one from your dad. You've been giving things away for weeks now. You eat alone. You stopped training with your squad." Grace kept her voice level, not clinical, not alarmed, just honest. "I need to ask you directly. Are you thinking about hurting yourself?" The question sat in the open air between them, plain and unadorned, exactly the way she'd meant it. She'd learned long ago that softening a question like this, wrapping it in euphemism, dancing around the edges, only made it easier for a person to answer around it too. Directness, delivered without judgment, was often the only thing that worked. Whitfield didn't answer right away. His jaw worked once, twice, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the smooth, practiced flatness Grace had heard from him for weeks. "I keep thinking it should have been me," he said. "Ames took point that day because I was slow getting my gear together. 30 seconds, maybe less. If I'd been ready on time, order would have been different, might have been me instead. You don't know that. I don't need to know it. I just need to think it enough times before it stops mattering whether it's true." He set down the bolt carrier he'd been holding, hands unsteady now in a way they hadn't been a moment ago. "I'm tired, Chaplain. I'm tired of doing the math on it every night." "Have you thought about how you'd do it?" Grace asked. She kept her voice steady, though her heart had begun beating harder against her ribs. This was the part where imprecision could cost something. She needed the real answer, not the answer that ended the conversation fastest. A long pause, then, quietly, "Yeah." It was one word, but it changed everything about what came next. Grace felt the weight of it settle into her chest, not panic, though something adjacent to it moved through her. But a clarifying certainty about what she had to do in the next hour, regardless of what it cost either of them. "Okay," she said. "Thank you for telling me that." I know that wasn't easy to say out loud. She let a beat pass before continuing. "I'm not going to leave you alone right now, and I'm not going to pretend this is something I can fix by talking with you for 20 more minutes. You need to see someone who's trained for this specifically. Tonight, not next week. I'll go with you. I'm not sending you somewhere alone." Whitfield's eyes went glassy, and for a moment Grace thought he might refuse outright. Pull back into the practiced calm he'd worn for weeks and insist he was fine, the way soldiers so often did when the door to help finally opened in front of them. Instead, something in him seemed to give way, quietly, without drama. "Okay," he said. His voice cracked slightly on the word. "Okay." They walked together to the aid station, Grace beside him the entire way, not rushing him, not filling the silence with reassurances she couldn't fully promise. Doc Alvarez met them without needing much explanation. One look at Grace's face told him what he needed to know, and began the process of getting Whitfield evaluated and routed to behavioral health, the machinery of care that existed for exactly this moment, if someone was willing to pull the lever in time. Grace stayed until Whitfield was settled, until the immediate danger had passed into the hands of people equipped to manage what came next. It was close to midnight when she finally left the aid station, and she stood outside for a long moment in the cold air, feeling the particular exhaustion that came not from lack of sleep, but from having carried something heavy and not yet had the chance to set it down. Word of what happened moved through the platoon the way things always did, not officially, but in the quiet channels soldiers used to pass real information faster than any briefing. Grace hadn't told anyone directly. She didn't need to. By the next afternoon, Reyes found her outside the mess tent, his face pale in a way she hadn't seen since the week Ames died. "Is it true? About Whitfield?" Grace chose her words carefully, protecting what needed protecting. "He's getting help. That's what matters." Reyes was quiet for a long moment, and something shifted visibly behind his eyes. The particular jolt of a man recognizing how close the ground had come to opening under someone he knew, someone he'd stood next to at memorial formation without truly seeing. That evening, for the first time in weeks, Doyle showed up at Reyes's bunk uninvited. Neither of them told Grace exactly what was said, but the next morning she saw them together near the motor pool. Not laughing, not fully at ease, but standing close enough to talk quietly, heads bent toward each other in the particular posture of men beginning, cautiously, to let each other back in. 3 weeks later, Grace drove out to the regional medical facility where Whitfield had been transferred for continued treatment. She hadn't planned the visit to be significant. She told herself it was routine, the kind of follow-up she did for any soldier under her care, regardless of how the story ended. But she noticed her own hands were tighter on the wheel than usual on the drive over, and she didn't pretend not to know why. She found him in a common room near the back of the facility, sitting by a window with a paperback open on his lap, not reading it so much as holding it. He looked different than she remembered, not fixed, not transformed into someone new, but less worn at the edges. His hair had grown out slightly past regulation, and there was color in his face that hadn't been there the night she walked him to the aid station. "Chaplain," he almost smiled. "Didn't expect you to drive all the way out here." "Wasn't out of my way," Grace said, which wasn't strictly true, and they both seemed to understand that without needing to say so. They talked for 20 minutes, mostly about small things, the food, which he complained about with real feeling for the first time in weeks, a counselor he liked, a physical therapy schedule he found tedious but was keeping up with anyway. Grace didn't push him toward the harder subjects. She'd learned by now that healing rarely announced itself in dramatic conversation. More often it showed up in a soldier complaining about cafeteria food with something like his old voice back. Near the end of the visit, Whitfield set the paperback down and looked at her directly, the way he hadn't been able to on the crate outside the motor pool weeks earlier. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't said anything that night," he said. "If you hadn't asked." Grace didn't offer him easy comfort. She'd learned that too, that soldiers in his position didn't need to be told everything was fine now. They needed the truth handled carefully. "I think about that too," she admitted. "I'm glad I asked. I'm gladder you answered." He nodded, and for a moment, neither of them said anything else. It didn't need filling. Back at the compound, the platoon had not become whole again. Grace never expected it to, not in a matter of weeks, not after a loss like Ames's. But something had shifted in the small, unglamorous ways that mattered more than any single dramatic reconciliation could have. Reyes and Doyle weren't close the way they had been before. The ease between them, the easy needling over MRAs, hadn't fully returned, and Grace suspected it might not. Not exactly, not in its old shape. But they worked together again without the cold distance that had defined the weeks after the mission. She saw them one afternoon carrying a box of Ames's personal effects to the supply tent for shipment home. His patches, a paperback with a folded corner, a watch he'd never gotten the chance to wear home himself. Neither man spoke much as they worked. They didn't need to. The shared task said what conversation hadn't yet been able to. Doyle stopped her once, briefly, near the motor pool. "Reyes told me what you told him, about the timeline and what he knew versus what he knows now." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable in the way soldiers often were when saying something sincere out loud. "Made me think about some things different. Doesn't mean it doesn't still hurt. Just means I'm not aiming it at him the same way anymore." "That's enough," Grace said. "That's more than enough." The battalion moved forward the way units always did. New taskings, new routes, the daily grind of a deployment that didn't pause for grief, even when grief was still very much present underneath it. Grace kept her office door open most nights, though the visitors came less frequently now, which she understood not as absence of need, but as a sign that the acute wound had begun, slowly, to close into something more like a scar, present, permanent, but no longer bleeding. She sat at her desk one evening in the quiet after most of the compound had gone to sleep, the space heater ticking against the cold, and allowed herself something she rarely did in the middle of a deployment. A moment of simply sitting with what had happened, without immediately reaching for the next task. She hadn't saved Ames. Nothing she did in the weeks after his death could undo the 30 seconds Whitfield still sometimes blamed himself for, or the call Reyes still occasionally second-guessed in the dark. That was the part of this job people rarely understood from the outside, that most of what she did wasn't fixing. It was staying present in rooms where nothing could be fixed, and trusting that presence itself was sometimes the only intervention available. But Whitfield was alive, and getting better, in a facility 3 hours from here instead of in a grave beside Ames. Reyes and Doyle were carrying a box together instead of avoiding each other's eyes across a mess tent. Neither outcome undid what had happened on that route. Both were, Grace thought, worth everything the last few weeks had cost her. She turned off her desk lamp, but left the door open behind her when she left, the way she always did. Not because anyone was likely to come tonight, but because someone, eventually, always did. Some stories don't end with a victory. They end with a door left open, a box carried together, a soldier still breathing 3 hours down the road. For Captain Grace Bennett, that was enough to call it a win. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If it moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. See you soon.